Well, thank you all. I've had the most wonderful time in Cambridge. I see why you guys like it here. The quality of the conversation, the quality of the sort of the social life and the intellectual life is the best I have ever seen. So I'm very delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be doing the third and the third of three lectures. This time I'm going to talk a little bit about, I've talked about the power of connection and how getting to the next 5 billion is going to, is going to fundamentally reshape the world that we live in ways that are hard for us to even imagine now. And yesterday I talked about the implications of this widespread connectivity on our identities and how companies and states will change as a result. So today what I want to do is I want to focus on governments and nations and how this will affect the future of conflict, combat, and intervention. And let me say from the outset that a lot of these concepts can be seen in a sort of terrifying light. I'm going to try to bring them to you in a sort of a factual light. And I think part of the reason that we should talk about these things is that there are answers to some of these issues. And if we get ahead of them, maybe we can prevent some of these possible negative outcomes and only focus on the really great outcomes. You know, I mentioned Genghis Khan on Monday, and obviously conflict has been with us for a long time, since long before, in fact, Genghis Khan. And of course, it will be with us for a while longer. The end of war is not anytime soon, unfortunately. And in many ways, conflict has remained similar over the centuries. What has changed, however, is not how many conflicts there are, but how visible they've become. And if anything, and people have tracked this pretty carefully, we've become more peaceful than we've ever been, even though it doesn't seem that way. With the amount of violence in human societies is declining actually precipitously, as best we can measure it, in the past several centuries due to developments like strong states, commerce, and expanded international networks. And by the way, Britain has had a lot to do with that, so thank you very much. I'm not sure the US has quite had the level of contribution that Britain has, but that's a separate discussion. But our history is littered with examples of mass murder and genocide and the worst atrocities we can commit against each other. So I, for example, was recently in Rwanda, the land of 1,000 hills, where in 1994, 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed in 100 days. The perpetrators of this genocide drove pickup trucks with radios on the back announcing the name of the Tutsis and where they were located. And the propaganda machine was so effective that those doing the killing had been convinced up until that of a Tutsi plot to destroy all the Hutus, who were in fact a majority. At the end, 83% of the Rwandan Tutsis were murdered, and 250,000 women were raped, with 70% of them becoming HIV positive. This is horrific. And between death and refugee flows, the population of the country was reduced by half. Right? This is 1994. So today, right, having been to Rwanda last week, literally, it's one of the most digitally connected countries in Africa. And while the government is controversial in its various human rights activities, the technology story is remarkable. So here I am, and I'm walking around, and it's a place where one could say it's a land of 1,000 innovations, I thought. And I tried to imagine how things would have been different if the same level of connectivity had existed 19 years ago, right? The one we have today, everybody having Android phones, iPhones, et cetera. Well, for one, the international community would have certainly had more visibility into what was happening and what happened, really, and may not have taken so long to call the attacks a genocide, right? This was over a period of a fairly long time. And if the government refused to name and shame the perpetrators, and we talked about this naming and shaming 2 lectures ago, citizens would have been able to find them online and fill that gap, right? So you have citizens and governments sort of naming and shaming. And the years of propaganda leading up to the genocide would not have gone unchallenged. And the Tutsis, running from the genocidaires, as they were called, would have had smartphones that would have allowed them to communicate through encrypted peer-to-peer networks, and we talked about that. And someone in the international community would have created some sort of an app quickly that would allow victims to track the movements of these evil people and allow you to move to safety away from the violence. Again, this is an example of where the empowerment saves lives in a very fundamental way. And perhaps some tech-savvy person from somewhere else would have been able to cyber attack the hate radio that was a sponsor of a lot of this evil. Why do I take you through this? Because it's in our lifetimes, guys. Every one of you was alive during this period. This is real and true. And what's happened in Rwanda is a chapter in history. And we all say, well, never again and always remember and so forth. But we know that future governments are going to try to carry out atrocities against different ethnic, political, religious, and gender groups at some point in the future in some of these countries, especially the wackier and stranger ones. So how will technology change this? Well, my view is that in the future, physical massacres on genocidal scales will be much harder to conduct. Right? This is good news. That leaders cannot commit the kind of atrocities with ambiguity that protected them in the past. This does not mean that the world will be rid of such atrocities. I mean, this morning on television, I was watching a report from the UN Commissioner on Syria, where more than 60,000 people are dying. And he reported that it's important to remember that among Syrian population, the vast majority of Syrians are normal, peace-loving people just trying to get through the day, and they're caught in this horrendous conflict. This is real, it's happening this week. But the number of leaders that are willing to carry out murder on the scale of what I'm talking about will absolutely be drastically reduced. This is a good thing. So with more eyes of the world watching, right, what do we think these evil people will do? Now they're being watched, before they weren't. Well, they'll focus less on physical genocide, good, but more on discrimination, which of course become worse, not good. And increased connectivity within societies will provide practitioners with the discrimination, sort of the people who discriminate basically, with entirely new ways to marginalize minorities and other disliked groups, whose own use of technology they will make them easier to forget, right, and target and otherwise discriminate against. So in this case, connectivity could work against peace. Governments that are used to repressing minorities in the physical world have a whole new set of options in this virtual world. And, imagine having to click, which race are you and so forth, and then having your network service be altered or much, much worse. You would literally be digitally deleted. And those that figure out how to combine their policies in both worlds will be that much more effective at repression. So we'll see things like, I'm going to call it content control, where you go and you erase content about a group from a country's internet entirely, or technological exclusion, where a government limits a particular group's access. It's a form of discrimination to the internet. The majority race or majority religion gets access, and these people we don't like will be discriminated against in a very, very material way. And I think that's likely and obviously very bad. Now, if compromising a group's ability to send out alert signals is a precursor to physical harassment or state violence, it also strips victims of their ability to document the abuse. So it has the double whammy of actually hurting and also preventing much of the alerting and the reporting that I'm describing. So soon it may be possible to say that what happens in a digital vacuum, if you will, didn't happen. Right? Not a good outcome. Now, an implicit or explicit arrangement between some citizens and states will emerge, for example, where people will trade information or obedience in exchange for better access. So again, the currency is information. You're denied information. You kowtow to the man in order to get what you need, right? And you're subordinate to them. So where noticeable cooperation with the government is demonstrated, the state will grant those individuals better connections, better devices, protection from online harassment, or a broader range of accessible sites. So in this case, not only states can do this, but in fact technically capable engage targets. What will this sort of look like? Well, folks know what haptic technology is. It's a technology where you can sort of put your hands in a glove and you can sort of feel it as though you were touching it. There are examples of this technology now that will produce uniforms that the soldiers can wear, that they can communicate through pulses, sending out signals to one another that result in a light pinch or a vibration to their particular body, so they can sort of feel what's going on. Helmets will have better visibility and built-in communications, allowing commanders to see what soldiers see and even backseat drive, right? So I see what you see, this is what you should now do. Camouflage that would allow soldiers to change their uniform's color and texture and pattern and scent. Uniforms might even be able to emit sounds to drown out noises that soldiers who want to hide. Again, you can imagine technological improvements, as they're called, that make this stuff much more deadly. Soldiers would also have the additional ability to cause all of this technology to self-destruct, so that the capture or theft would not yield valuable intelligence secrets. Now, wrapping all of this together would be a hefty layer of cybersecurity, much more secure than we would use, that enables sort of instant data transmission with a cocoon of electronic protection. So owning military robots, which is what I'm talking about, whether these are fighters or drones, but particularly the UAVs or drones as they're known, will become a strategic priority for pretty much every country. And this will happen in our lifetime. The first to acquire them will gain an edge, and the last will acquire them just to maintain the sovereignty. Think of it as a sort of a drone race. And states will have to work hard to maintain the security of their shores and their borders from the threat of these enemy UAVs, which by design are hard to detect. So as autonomous navigation means sort of self-driving, becomes more possible, drones can evolve to become think of them as mini cruise missiles, which once fired cannot be stopped by interference. This is very, very dangerous. Now, the most effective way to target an enemy drone is probably not physically, but in fact electronically, by breaching the UAV's cybersecurity defenses. So warfare then becomes a battle of persuasion, a fight to co-opt and convince and persuade these machines to do something other than the mission that they were launched for. And you could imagine whole groups whose jobs are to make sure that happens in a direct and active attack against these things that are coming at you in each of these states. So how are we going to sort this out? It's pretty frightening. Well, diplomatic solutions, which might involve a good faith treaties between states not to send surveillance drones into each other's airspace, or implicit agreements with surveillance drones, that would be an example. That would be an example of what people would do. But you could imagine international requirements that surveillance drones be easily distinguished between bomber drones. Now here you are, you're looking at this drone and you're saying, is that a bomber drone or a surveillance drone? Well, I'm going to run, right? So it's the correct reaction to this, right? So you could imagine, for example, states joining together in some sort of a drone shield, right? In which case we'll see the world's first drone-based no-fly zone. And ultimately, so for example, the European Union, all full of very civilized people and government, would immediately agree to this for obvious reasons. So the proliferation of robots and UAVs, will increase conflict in the world. Whenever states acquire them, they'll be eager to test out their new shiny tools. But in many ways, it also decreases the likelihood of an all-out war. Because remote warfare will be taking place more than at any time in history. But historically, remote warfare has thought of mostly in terms of weapons delivered by missiles. But in the future, it will be much more commonplace and acceptable to further separate the actor from the scene of the battle, which is why I wanted to talk about this. So judging from recent trends, we can assume that one effect of these changes will be less public involvement in the emotional and political levels. And you see this in the US, for example. So with a greater number of combat options that do not inflame public opinion, the government can pursue its security objectives without having to consider declaring war or committing troops, and at some level lessening the possibility of outright war. So on the one hand, it's frightening. On the other hand, it may in fact reduce the likelihood of what we think of as all-out war or full-scale war. So the forecast here of fewer civilian casualties, less collateral damage, and reduced risk of human injury are welcome, but the shift toward a more automated battlefield will introduce significant new vulnerabilities and challenges as it limits others. Chief among these, of course, is maintaining the cybersecurity of these equipments and systems. the data flow between the devices, the ground robots, the UAVs, and the human command must be fast, secure, and unimpeded by poor infrastructure, of course. In wars where robotic elements are present, both sides are going to employ cyber attacks to try to attack them, right? And we've begun to see a little bit of cyber attack between states, and there are a number of examples in the last few years, and I think we should anticipate quite a few more. These could be by spoofing, impersonating a network identity, employing decoys to disrupt the enemy sensor grids and degrade enemy battle networks. There's a famous example involving Stuxnet and the Iranian nuclear program, which we can talk about. So manufacturers are then going to respond to this by putting in fail-safe mechanisms to limit the damage of these attacks. But one concern is that there's always bugs in software, and it'll always be difficult to know that you're completely bulletproof. And until there's AI systems that can completely mimic the capability of the human brain, which is going to be a very long time from now, I don't think we're going to see completely unmanned systems in this context replacing human soldiers. If you think about it from a machine learning perspective, which is the current most important area of computer science, these things have to be trained at some level. And sort of the first rule of combat is you can never really train for what's going to happen. You just do your best. And so there's going to have to be some human control. But even highly intelligent machines have glaring faults. The intelligence of these machines, as drawn, I think, in the next little while, is so specialized, and they're tested in such narrow environments, that they're going to always encounter enemy workarounds that they did not expect, and they'll be forced to evolve their products in one way or another. And what's interesting is these asymmetric encounters will pose unpredictable challenges for all of the designers that play in this sort of space. Now for states, well, what's going to happen is the UN Security Council will remain the only really international body that's both inclusive of all of the nations and capable of sort of bestowing legality to these sort of military interventions. So you can imagine, for example, in an extreme situation, you've got some crazy country, you've got a group of countries coming together to disable literally an errant country's military robots. And I suspect we will see that. Because this stuff is too exciting for some of these evil people to use. They won't use it well, they'll get out of control, people will have to go intervene and fix, in the same way that other people have had to intervene for humanitarian reasons. So you can imagine, for example, that member states of NATO, right, very important, pushing to, what is a new mandate for intervention that could authorize states to send combat troops into these combat zones, to establish safe zones and independent and uncompromised networks. Think of it as sort of an aggressive way of saying it's got to be safe, it's got to be okay. So the pressure for action will find other outlets in the form of ad hoc coalitions involving citizens and companies, individuals and businesses that can contribute to the maintenance of the vitally important communications network in a conflict zone. Future forms of reconnecting the internet or helping a rebel-held area set up an independent and secure network will all happen. In the event of a state or state-sponsored manipulation of communications, we'll see a concerted effort by international stakeholders to intervene and restore free and uninterrupted access without waiting for the UN approval. So what will happen as we sort of go through these, and we have little experiments, fortunate or unfortunate, along this line that I'm drawing, you'll see, for example, states with small militaries but strong technology sectors will become new power players because they can contribute something far beyond their size. The ability to sort of understand and help, whether it's surveillance or cyber attack or whatever, to make the world a safer place. And we can discuss or guess which countries those might be, but it's going to be an important geopolitical strength that will be developed over this time. So coalitions of the connected, if you will bring political will and digital weaponry like high bandwidth, jerry-rigged, independent mobile networks and enhanced cybersecurity into these zones. You could imagine that these countries would contribute to military interventions and even offer their own robots and aerial drone armies to sort of help somebody in trouble. And I think at the same time, because these are things where we're all going to say, oh my God, this is really horrific, how can we help? Technology companies, NGOs, and individuals will participate in these coalitions to try to bring something valuable to the table. There's going to be a lot of companies that will do things like open source software tailored to the needs of a people inside of a country. And they'll offer free upgrades to all their products. People can upgrade to the new version. NGOs can coordinate their telecoms to build the accurate databases of a given population, its needs, mapping out where the most unstable or isolated pockets are. A lot of countries have instability inside of their borders, and we're going to see this played out because of this. And exactly how, we don't know, but we know that instability will become sort of a major subject in this area. And citizens, of course, can volunteer to test out all the new networks that are being built and all these products, and they're gonna help find bugs and vulnerabilities, and as well as providing critical user feedback. So to sort of put a bow on this, or try to sort of get it to a sort of a thought completion point, conflict is going to remain, right? Unfortunately, we don't know how to eliminate that in human society yet. But the ways that we engage in it, and the ways that we enter into combat, the ways states relate to each other and their people, and the ways that regimes and rebels work against each other are going to be radically different in both positive and negative ways. Part of the reason that I wanted to do this is, first, as I said, I'm an optimist, and I believe in our shared future, sort of living in this new connected age. And I believe if we talk about this, right, that each of us and all of you can take the time to understand, how would you fix this? How would you make this decision? As a legal matter, as a leadership matter, as a technological matter. If the technology is this powerful, it needs to be shaped by us, right? And what's great about it, and I'll sort of finish up with this as sort of a summary, the fact of the matter is, it is in our hands, right? These are not, the things that I'm describing are not being done by random people from outer space. They're being done by the collection of all of us. And if we talk about it and we decide what's right and what's wrong, we figure out how to regulate things, we figure out how to stop the bad stuff and encourage the good stuff, this is going to be a remarkable future. So let me finish by talking about the last couple of days, and then have time for questions and comments on this. And I appreciate this is pretty tough stuff, so I want to hear your comments and views on all of this. I think we started, and again, as I said, it's a great privilege to be here. We started on Monday by what I view as overwhelming good news, which is that 5 billion people are joining the 2 billion people already in the global conversation. And we don't exactly know what they are going to want to do, but we know that they're going to want to be part of this, and they're coming. Most estimates indicate that they're coming in the next 3 to 4 years. Now, what will this network do? And I'm finished with the notes, thank you. What will these networks enable to do? Well, we talked about this in the first lecture. How about education, literacy? How about entertainment? How about finding out all the injustices that are currently being perpetrated against vulnerable people, especially women and children? What about medicine? Right, again, think about you're sitting in your little rural village, and now all of a sudden you can text, because texting works pretty well on all these networks, and eventually with smart browsers you'll be able to browse and get the critical medical information that you need in a village that has no doctor and no real opportunity for anything. And of course you have no textbooks and so forth. So this sort of explosion in one generation from knowing just what was told to you in your village to knowing all of the world's information is a truly profound shift. Now we think it's changing for us, because we're excited about the rate of things, but imagine going from knowing almost nothing to knowing almost everything in a few years. Probably pretty stressful, but also pretty exhilarating for the people that are going through this. We talked a little bit about the role of corporations. A number of you talked about this and are concerned about this. My own view of corporations is that the vast majority of human beings in the world are honest and positive and well-meaning, and not all the corporations can be full of them. There's simply an insufficient number of them. Most corporations, and I certainly hope Google, will be well run and will be done on a set of principles which are about making the world a better place. It's good shareholder value, by the way, because also the smart employees also want to work for a cause. They want to make the world a better place. They don't want to just work for money. They want to believe that their work, their passion, they only have one life, one career, what have you. They want it to matter, right? So there are many reasons why corporations can participate in this overwhelming transition that we're going to see over the next decade in a positive context, and there are always exceptions. We talked a little bit about digital identity, and I expressed to all of you the importance of managing your own digital identity, and that you will have multiple and there will be more digital identities than human identities. And I also spent some time describing that people are going to fight over digital identities in complicated ways. People might steal it, they might manipulate it, you might yourself manipulate it, but ultimately you're going to care a lot about your digital identity. And digital identities, because of the way history works and because of the lack of a delete button, digital identities start at birth. And unfortunately, it does not look like opting out strategies of having a digital identity at all are really effective, because in that scenario, someone can make one up for you and it can be used against you without your permission. We talked yesterday at some length about privacy and security, and of course a great concern, in my view, which I said clearly and I'll say again, is that we have to fight for our privacy or we're going to lose it in a series of steps. And I can explore that more if you'd like. I also believe, and a number of people in the audience made some comments about this, that at the end of the day in democracies and the citizens of democracies are going to demand regulation for what they see as the excesses in this space. And they will differ by country, but there will be regulation in these areas, simply because the possibility for abuse is too great. Obviously, I would love it if corporations could all behave perfectly and individuals would behave perfectly, but I think realistically there will be excesses and there will be some form of regulation. Today I wanted to emphasize a couple of things in my comments, and again, explore them with you as well. I believe it's true that the trend of less human deaths per unit of time will continue. This has been well tracked, and in fact the world was far, far more dangerous 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, on a percentage of people who died from causes that they should not have. But I do think that there's going to be more skirmishes, because it's easier to have these little skirmishes for the reasons that I described. Think of it as a hierarchy: yelling, cyber war, real war, right? So we're going to yell for a while, and then we're going to get so mad we're going to have a little cyber war. But we're going to say, oh, we're not going to have a real war, right? But then occasionally we're going to cross the line and have a real war. And in the context of real wars, where the boundary between poking and pushing and prodding and playing to your domestic audience versus an escalation to real conflict is something which we have not really identified. We don't really know where that boundary is, but I can assure you that the military and political leaders around the world are going to spend a lot of time trying to define where those lines are. In the thing that worries me the most, which I wanted to highlight today, the rise of drones and robots. Not so much that a small number of drones and robots are sitting around, but the fact that mass manufacturing, the process of automation, new technologies will enable a much broader sphere of crazy people in crazy countries to have these sorts of things. We have to think about what we want to do about that fact. If we don't act, this will happen because the technology will allow it. We should figure out how to act to make sure that only good things happen out of this discovery. And I have two sort of final comments. I think one is and I said this in the first lecture, I genuinely believe that humans and computers will ultimately take on the duties that they're best at. What are computers really good at? They're very good at needle and a haystack problems, and they have perfect memory. Their judgment is not so good, right? And in fact, the judgment has to be learned by iteration. And there are many judgments that we don't have time for computers to learn. But we do know is that they can remember everything, and they will remember everything. That's a natural order for computers and knowledge and systems and all the things that we're building. A natural order for humans is judgment and leadership. And there are many, many sayings in this, but I will tell you that when you think about this for a while, what you conclude is that the single most important thing all of us can do is to commit ourselves to education. I would much rather have the person on the other side of the table be a highly educated Cambridge graduate, right, than somebody who's had no benefit of education at all and is working based on false intuitions from false gods without any choices. Right? And if I can't have a highly educated Cambridge graduate, I like to have somebody who's used all these online networks, or at least understands that there is doubt as to assertions, that critical thinking, and all the things that we care about. And I would encourage all of you, since you've had the benefit of being in such an extraordinary place, to realize that many, many people do not have the privilege that you have and that I have had, right? And that it's part of our job to give them that, right? And I wanted to announce a little bit of phenomenal news. I'm quite convinced that there is a hero in your government, an actual public servant who did something amazing. His name is Michael Gove, and he's the Director of Education. Listen up. And today they announced that they're going to take the computer science programs and make them part of something called the EBAC, which is the English Baccalaureate. And this means that the kind of stuff that we're talking about, the technological basis, the scientific information, the kind of critical thinking and scale that's possible in the world that I'm talking about, will become much more commonplace. I personally believe that this decision will be one of the key decisions that will bring tremendous economic growth to Britain, and to England in particular, because a consequence of this is ultimately an awful lot of new companies that are global, that are leaders and so forth over the next few decades. So with that, thank you all very much.